So welcome everyone and thanks for joining us this morning. This is part of Green Infrastructure Week, sponsored by AECOM, a week of insight and commentary created by over 25 partners to highlight the technologies and innovations that will be needed to deliver the biggest gains in our global transition to net zero. You can find out more and see all of the events at greeninfrastructureweek.com. So thank you for joining us this morning. My name is McKenna. I'm head of net zero at KTN and will be the chair of this session this morning. And for anyone that's unfamiliar to KTN, Innovate UK KTN exists to connect innovators with new partners and new opportunities beyond their existing thinking, accelerating ambitious ideas into real world solutions. And I'm super pleased to be here and chairing this panel this morning with three great panelists who are going to be talking about that innovation that's being deployed at scale and being developed at the moment, and be able to see those ideas being translated into those real world solutions. So it should be a really exciting panel this morning. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we do get started. If you do have any technical issues this morning, please pop those into the chat, and my colleagues, Chloe and Alan, should be able to help with those. If you do have a question for any of the panelists throughout the session, we do encourage you to use the Q&A box for that. If the question is for a particular panelist, then please note that down in the question, or if it's open for all panelists, then you can just pop in that it's for all. Please feel free to kind of add questions in throughout the session. You don't have to wait until we move into the Q&A part of the session today. So please keep them coming in throughout. The session itself will be recorded, and a recording will be available later today on the greeninfrastructure.com website. I think that kind of covers the housekeeping and intro. So the session today is really around how infrastructure needs to change to work with green vehicles. Climate change, as I think we can all appreciate, is one of the most pressing problems of our time, and it does affect everyone. And there's no more important priority for us now as an economy or as a society than our drive towards achieving net zero. And without taking that urgent action, we could risk causing further irreversible damage to our planet. Transport sits at the center of our economy and society as it connects people, places, goods, and services. And innovation and the wide-scale deployment of that innovation is needed across the various transport systems that we have to both benefit our economy and society and environment, but also to enable us to achieve net zero. Now, we're already seeing electric cars, electric vehicle takeoff and landing vehicles, and hydrogen trains all in development. But is our infrastructure keeping up with this vehicle technology? So this session today is really to explore what infrastructure changes and developments are needed across all modes of transport to help us reach net zero. We're joined this morning by three fantastic speakers, Sam, Tim, and Simon. Each of them are going to have 10 minutes to present each on the various kind of programs and projects that they're delivering within this space. And then we'll move into an opportunity to do a little bit of a Q&A and panel discussion to unpick and unlock some of these, some of the elements of this a little bit further. So I'm going to finish up there and actually hand over to the people that you've actually came to listen to today and hear from. So first up, we've got Sam Mackilligin, Director of Zero Carbon Energy Systems at AECOM. So Sam, I'm going to hand over to you now, so feel free to share your screen and kick off your presentation.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you for that introduction. I've taken the opportunity to set a bit of a scene here this morning in the first session. My role at AECOM is twofold. First is to find those projects that we can be delivering now, but it's also to take the long view and to help our organisation understand how the transition affects all of our very diverse teams working on very diverse bits of infrastructure. And mindful of the fact that much of the work that we're doing is going to see infrastructure delivered and used in the 20s and 30s, it really is around taking the long view. But mindful of the fact that this is a fast moving space and there's infrastructure being delivered now. So this presentation, I'm hoping to address those two topics. So one is, what is the transition? What is the long view of the transition? But also, what are the things that are happening now and how are they shaped? So next slide. let's see if I can get it to the next slide. There we are. I got to share the screen, but not to move the slide. So there we are. I found the right button to press. Okay, this is a slide I use quite a lot with our internal teams, but also with our clients. It looks quite a messy one, but what it's intending to do is to capture the many different dimensions of the energy transition and to cover both heat and transport, because those two things have got to happen in parallel and have to play to each other to a certain extent. And our many teams are working both in physical infrastructure, which needs heat of various different types, and moving people and goods around. So they need to be planning for and conscious of that transition. And the rather messy figure is trying to tell the story of how we'll seek to use less energy as a first lever, and then where we will apply electric and hydrogen as the two primary fuels that will fuel the transition in those different areas of use, and then where they will replace the fossil fuels. So as you can see there in heat, I'm playing the message that hydrogen is for high heat and the rest is electric. It's a big challenge, but broadly that's what the system is going to demand. And then in transport, we can see the different modes of transport, and I've taken surface transport there, and Simon later is going to talk about not surface transport, so he's already mucked up my slide, and I'm going to have to make it more complex. But you get the flavour, and it's intended to play the message of what we can see in the 20s, but also how pervasive those fueling solutions are going to be in the 20s and in the 30s and the 40s as we move towards a much more zero carbon world, and how those different modes are going to change differently through that time. So on the next slide, I'm drilling down a little bit more into transport and looking at, and hopefully you can read it this time, so you can see where electric will be introduced and where hydrogen will, and there'll be a couple of places where both hydrogen and electric will play a role. But on this slide, I'm trying to start now to think about the infrastructure and what's driving the shape of that infrastructure. So today, it's all about moving people from the habit of using fossil fuels and the infrastructure that supports the fueling and transport through fossil fuels to one where we encourage the change of behavior and we have infrastructure that supports that change of behavior. For the 20s, it's around that. So there's a certain level of making it as similar as possible, making the experience similar. So we go to fill up. So there's a place where we go to fill up, and we do it in a particular time, and that's it, to a certain extent, driving the way we fuel. But in the 30s and the 40s, looking 15, 20 years ahead, most of the people doing that won't have experienced that habit of going and filling up once a week at the fuel station. That won't be relevant to them. They'll be making the most of the technology it has and seeing the role that technology has within the energy system. So the infrastructure demands in the 30s and 40s can and I would argue will be very different from those of today. So I'm now going to be slightly controversial, because I like being controversial because it creates debate. And I'm going to stick a few pictures and tell you what I think is happening in the 20s and what I think is going to happen in the 30s and the 40s. So let's get the right button. There we are. So currently, what we're seeing emerging is fueling infrastructure, and it's not all fueling infrastructure, and that's the reason why I make controversial comments, because I'm wrong, but I am also to a certain extent right. There is a feeling that is similar to a fueling location. It's a destination. You go, you fill up, you spend as close to the duration of time to fuel a fossil fuel vehicle to get a full charge, because that's what I'm used to doing, and that's driving a lot of the infrastructure that we're seeing deployed here. So we're seeing on the left hand side there, Shell's Fulham charging destination, which is their fossil fuel location rebadged as a charging location, and that's one approach. And then you see an Ionity fast charge location out on the strategic road network, which is sat next to pretty close. It is right next to a petrol station, so it's where we're used to going, and we know we can get it there, so that's really good. So there's integrations into the fossil fuel network. There's some destination charging, and there's some on-street charging that's starting to occur, but it's rapid charge. It's to address range anxiety, because those people that are changing behavior, that's their primary concern. However, what we will see in this decade is some sort of variable pricing that's starting to encourage people to charge at night, because that's what the system will wish to encourage them to. So we'll move to a situation where many of the cars that we have that are electric on the road, you go to them in the morning and they're fully charged. And therefore the rapid charge is for long journeys. It's on the strategic road network. It's not for every day. And that's the transition that we'll see in the 2020s. And then as we look forward to the next 2 decades after that, I'm arguing, and this again is to try and be a bit controversial, is that those fields of battery containers that we see sitting next to the grid are actually, to a certain extent, the expansion of storage on the network is going to be all of those vehicles that are sitting for 80 to 90% of their time stationary, and they are going to be plugged in. And so the infrastructure that we're going to see is going to start to become quite invisible, because we'll be using it all of the time. And that will be our grid storage battery. It's those parks of cars plugged in on the network, where some way the technology isn't there yet, but the technology should be there. And most of the lithium that we mine will be going into transport and not into stationary batteries. Stationary batteries will be for future life. And let's imagine those as our grid storage assets. Anyway, so I'll leave Tim to pick up that, because I think I've hopefully laid the ground for Tim. I've also hopefully opened the door to Simon to tell us all about the exciting stuff that's happening in aviation, which I'm looking forward to hearing. And I'll pass back now to Emma. I think that was my 10 minutes.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much, Sam. And really, really great to kind of hear, I suppose, the timeline of what's needed now and what's kind of fueling. I do not mean to actually use that word, but instigating that change that's happening now and what's going to influence it kind of much later as well as we move into the 20s and 40s. So thank you so much for taking us through that. And I think it'll be really interesting to kind of unpick that a little bit further when we move into the Q&A and panel. Our next speaker that we have joining us this morning is Tim Rose, Program Manager of the Energy Superhub Oxford at Pivot Power. So Tim, I'm going to hand it over to you now for your presentation.
Thanks, Emma. Let me just share my screen.
Yeah.
Oops, 1 second. Hopefully that's...
Yep, that's great. We got it now. Thank you.
Is that working? Great. Okay. Yes, thank you very much. Sam, that's really interesting start and some interesting points, which I will. Whoops, let me go back up. Which I will touch on. I'm lucky enough to lead a really exciting project in Oxford called the Energy Superhub Oxford project. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but before I do that, I'd like to just sort of also do a bit of scene setting, I suppose, in a car and fleet charging perspective. And I'd like to start by just sort of shamelessly borrowing a couple of slides that I picked up from the Energy Task Force, the EV Task Force and the ZEMO recent report on charging the future, and a very interesting webinar actually that those guys were running yesterday, just to sort of talk a little bit about what's the sort of the scale of the problem that we're facing in charging. And I think we all know that that there is a huge infrastructure challenge. In answer to the question that we're sort of trying to face in this particular session, I think we're not yet allowing infrastructure is not yet keeping up with the technology. You know, we have some supply issues at the moment with the current situation in terms of EVs, but that will be temporary, and we know that the ramp curve is very significant. So this is a chart that ZEMO actually presented yesterday, which I think just again puts one sort of point in about the sort of scale of the number of cars that we're talking about. Now, this is cars only. You can add another 15% to this for vans, but you can see that we're looking at some 2.5 million battery EV cars by 2030. That's 13 times more than we have today. So about 27 million cars on the road by 2035. So that's a huge shift, obviously, from ICE vehicles. And what does that mean in terms of charging infrastructure? And this is the chart that I loved. And actually, this is the first time I think I've seen a sort of combined view of a combination of public and private charging and the different types of charging priorities that different users are going to need. So really think this is a very helpful perspective. And this is from the task force again, who interviewed an awful lot of people in coming to this aim. But some key kind of issues here, I think, to position the scale again. You can see if you add up those numbers in the public box, there's about 500,000 public charge points that are going to be needed, and that's charge points for off private land, basically in en route rapid charging. We talked about local hubs, sort of I'll talk about in a minute. On street residential provided by local authorities, etc. 500,000 compared to 26,000 of those that we have today. So that gives you some idea of the scale of change that's going to happen and going to be needed over the next 10-15 years. And then on the private side, you can see obviously millions. There's a real predomination towards home charging. I think that's probably no surprise to all of us, but a lot of depot charging as well. And you can, I don't know if you have the numbers up there, it's in the many millions, but at the moment we have about 300,000. So this is sort of setting the scale of the site, the type of hill we have to climb to meet these infrastructure challenges. I think just a couple of other points I thought was very interesting that came out of this report. Also, in relation to what Sam was saying about where people are going to charge and their sort of thoughts about what their preferences would be. In the near term, it looks like about half and half would be pretty much split. People, private drivers would be split pretty much 50% in terms of whether they want to charge their car at home or at a rapid charging hub of the sort I'll talk about in a second. But as you move forward, that actually shifts a little bit, and I think more people are expecting to charge at home. But so a lot of people in the short term do expect to charge in those hub type environments that Simon was talking about. And another point before I move on, is that this is not all about private cars. And I think one of the big messages that's come through for me is that it's going to be the fleets which are really driving uptake in the UK. They are certainly going to be right in the lead. They are driving the import of new car volumes. And as a result of that, are going to be driving the second-hand market in the UK as well. So I think we really need to learn from what the fleet's expectations, what their use case is going to be, to understand how that's likely to impact the way in which the rest of us all charge our cars as we move forward. So lots of barriers that were raised. I won't go through all of those, but again, by that report alone, but connection cost and the process of connecting is a really major one. And that's one that I'm going to talk about now just for a minute or so. So moving on to the project that I'm involved in. What's the Energy Superhub Oxford? I won't go into all of this. It's a demonstrator project, part funded by UKRI. And it's showcasing transport, EV transport, but also battery storage and low carbon heating. And I won't go into the heating part today, but I will talk on batteries to pick up on the point that Sam made in a minute. So the critical thing I would say here is that this has been absolutely essential that that we're working with the local authority here, in this case, Oxford City Council. So absolutely central to everything that we're doing, particularly on the transport side. And I think that's definitely going to be a key message moving forward. You know, we're not going to be able to roll this this sort of infrastructure out without the absolutely in close involvement of public and private collaboration and the local authorities. So this is a bit about how it works. So our approach is to try and get around some of those issues of grid constraints. We know the local area networks are very constrained, and what our approach does is build a private network from the main transmission network in this case, actually, and that's where this is a little bit unique. So it's a 7-kilometre private wire from the main transmission network station in Oxford to a park and ride in the west of the city. And what this is going to do for us is, because what that's doing is providing oodles of power. I mean, we really can bring many megawatts to charging stations. It's really going to lend itself towards those sort of 65,000 ultra rapid charging points that were in the middle of that picture that I showed you a minute ago. But also it'll support depot charging at rapid speeds. So from a private point of view, the sort of examples that we're looking at here, the first of our opportunities is actually to electrify the bus fleet here in Oxford. And that's going to be done part funded by the Zebra regional bus scheme. It's about 160 buses. Those are going to be connected just at that sort of roundabout at the top right of the picture there, probably starting in the next year or so. And then we'll be looking to provide rapid charging also for the council's electric fleet, and the council is electrifying the first 40 of those vehicles under this particular project. But we could also provide charging for work-based locations elsewhere along this route. I mean, Stagecoach is another bus company that's part of the Zebra scheme, and that will be a candidate too. On the public side, we are installing and building right now this charging station on the west of the city, and this is going to be basically it's actually going to be the largest one in the UK when it opens in the next month or two. Some up to over 40 chargers, lots of different charging speeds, so meeting all sorts of different use cases, people driving through, people parking their cars and going into town. And it's one model. It's not the only model, but certainly it's going to be an important one. And this has been done every step of the way with the council. We've made huge learnings along the way, which I'm very happy to talk about in some of the Q&A as well. So that's the sort of transport side of this. This is a transport section. I'm not going to talk a lot about the power side, but I think it's relevant. So I'm just going to touch on batteries, because the other part of this project is installing a very large battery right at the substation. Again, this is transmission connected. And there's all sorts of interesting and innovative things about this battery as you'd expect of a UKRI project, which I won't go into. I'm happy to talk about that later. But Key point about this is it's not actually powering the charge points. It's connected to the private wire. It's not powering those charging points. What it is doing, and the two ways this is relevant, is that it's certainly by having a battery here, providing services to the grid and trading on the markets, that's helping to share the costs of a significant connection with the national grid. So that's one thing it's doing. And the other thing it's doing, really picking up on Sam's point, this is all part of providing services to the national grid, which are really helping stabilize the grid and providing a balancing type of capability, which is going to be more and more important as we bring on all those megawatts, so gigawatts of wind and solar over the next few years. So it has a number of routes to play in this. We can charge the chargers with this if we want to, but that's not the main aim of the project. So just to finish off, this is the first project of this type. We're actually we're working on 40 of these different projects, all connected to the national grid. The next two, particularly Coventry, which is an interesting one, maybe we can touch on a little bit later, is underway. So is one at Birmingham, both batteries, and at Coventry, we're looking at the first private wire there, very much focused on buses in that case as well. So very, very, very interesting. But is this the only model? Of course not. It's only going to work where we have transmission connected capability, which is the main focus of our business model. Obviously, for DNO connections, that's a different kettle of fish, and many others are working in that area. But as I say, lots and lots of possible future flexibility around this sort of model. The key thing that we're doing is providing quite a lot of power for that rapid type of charging. So there'll be lots of these projects to follow. I'll leave it there and hand on to Simon, well, back to Emma to start with, but very happy to take questions on this. Lots of interesting learnings that I'm very keen to talk about as we go forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was great. And I think really kind of a really interesting, comprehensive overview of kind of a very exciting project that's happening at quite a large scale. And I think there's been some things that you've mentioned there that I'd be able to really love to understand a little bit more, particularly around the learnings that you've had through the kind of development and delivery of that project. Just a reminder for all of our attendees here, if you do have any questions for any of our speakers, I know we've got a couple in the Q&A box, but please do keep them coming in, and we should have plenty of time to respond to those when we move into the Q&A session. I'm now going to hand over to our final speaker of this morning, which is Simon Masters, Deputy Challenge Director of the Future Flight Challenge at UKRI. Simon, over to you now.
Thanks, Emma, and good morning, everyone. There we go. So yes, I'm going to talk a bit about the Future Flight Challenge Programme, which is one of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund R&D programmes that's being delivered by UK Research and Innovation. Give a quick overview, first of all, of what the programme is, once my computer decides to advance the slide. There we go. So what we are focusing on is what many are calling the third revolution in aviation. So really moving beyond the current offering of passenger aircraft, which are fairly similar, towards really exploiting new forms of transport, such as drones, urban air mobility, or eVTOL, flying taxis, whatever you want to call them, sort of mobility vehicles, and also really setting the stage for the future of electric or hydrogen or hybrid electric aircraft, and demonstrating that for us at small scale to start with. So what does all that mean? It means all sorts of opportunities, some of which we thought of before, and some of which we've only learned while doing this program. The utilization of some of these vehicles is almost just down to the imagination of those companies who are going to operate them. And there are some examples here, but particularly for this morning, we have a particular interest in integrated transport systems, and also how new forms of green aviation can help to connect the more rural and remote parts of the UK. So we've put these three different types of vehicles in the center of our overall kind of project plan, but we very much recognize that actually for these vehicles to be successful, and indeed for our program to be successful, we have to consider the environment and the ecosystem that they will operate in. And chief amongst those is actually the physical infrastructure. There's very little point in us investing large amounts of taxpayers' money, funding some exciting R&D, only to discover that these vehicles cannot operate effectively, because there's nowhere for them to take off or land, and there's nowhere for them to charge or refuel. So that's why infrastructure for us is one of these key components that you see around the kind of outer ring of this circle. So overall, what we're trying to do is really take a broad-based approach to how these new forms of aviation will fit in to some existing and indeed some new use cases. And that requires us to look at a wider industry and beyond. It requires us to kind of get outside of our comfort zone. Many of us in the team are from the aviation or aerospace sector. It does require us to talk to people in energy sector, in civil engineering, in software, in all sorts of areas that we really need to make sure that we create a sort of integrated end-to-end ecosystem for these new vehicles. And of course, we want to put people at the heart of this with a focus on social benefits and desirability. And actually, net zero and green and really highlighting those benefits is a key thing that we're doing. And we have found in some of the public consultation exercises we're doing, actually the public views towards these new forms of aviation are very much shaped by the capability for them to operate with zero emissions. That's very much seen as a desirable factor for many. So at the moment, we have funded 48 projects using up just under £34 million of our overall budget, and there are some examples there. But what I'd like to do is just to look at an example from each of those different types of vehicles that I've discussed, but also just look at how infrastructure plays a large part in what those projects are doing. So the first one of these is looking at the introduction of hybrid electric aircraft. The aircraft you see in the center is actually quite a small, it's a 6-seat Cessna that was actually built in the 1970s, but has been modified to be a hybrid electric aircraft. It actually has two engines, one at the front, one at the back, and the one at the front is battery powered. This in itself is quite exciting. It's one of the few aircraft in the world that's been modified to do this. What we've done in working with this company is actually to look at how it can be operated from existing UK airports. So in the bottom left, we have Kirkwall Airport in the Orkney Islands, and the bottom right, Exeter Airport. And this aircraft has operated from both of those facilities, and they have started to look at what sort of charging mechanisms they need, how long does it take to charge the aircraft, which is obviously a key consideration for operators, how far can it fly. All those sorts of operational aspects are now being looked at, all the way through to things like safety. So if you are charging this aircraft with some high voltage DC supply, how close can you park a conventional aircraft that's being refueled with jet fuel? You know, what are the safety implications? And how does the airport and the airport operator, how do they have to adapt their existing infrastructure to be able to accommodate electric aircraft? So there's been a lot of learning from that. I think there's certainly more to come. And whilst the aircraft, I guess, rightly takes center stage, actually some of the key learnings have come from the ground infrastructure side and have come from just the airport operators getting a sense of how much electrical energy they're going to need and frankly, where they're going to get it from. Kirkwall Airport is in quite a handy position because it benefits from huge amounts of offshore wind and tidal energy that gets generated in that part of Scotland. But for other airports, you know, there is a real question about how the electrical infrastructure will be able to handle the requirement to recharge lots of aircraft at once. In terms of physical infrastructure, the next one, I've made the bold choice of trying to play a video. I do hope this works. Okay, this is one of our more high-profile projects. It's actually based in Coventry, I think Coventry earlier, and they're actually running demonstrations from this week. This is a new concept. This is an all-new type of infrastructure for vertical urban air mobility and drones to operate in urban environments. And they have actually built something that looks a little bit like this. This is obviously a mock-up rather than the actual one. This is looking at new infrastructure and how it could be embedded in cities to support greater mobility.
In the UK, we have cities that could benefit from more public transportation services. London is very well served, and I think part of the Future Flight Challenge is all about levelling up and spreading that social equity urban airports can provide a new form of connectivity very quickly, because we have a compact solution that's rapidly deployable. We think it can unlock a huge amount of value for citizens.
Okay, the third project to focus on is actually one looking at drones, which again presents yet another different sort of infrastructure challenge. This was a project actually that we ran during the period of COVID lockdown, and was actually, apart from the infrastructure considerations I'm going to talk about, was actually a quite interesting project, because they were actually flying medical supplies and indeed the mail with Royal Mail from Perranporth to the Isles of Scilly, which is one of the more remote locations in the UK. And what they found is this drone itself is quite a large drone. It has a payload of 100 kilograms, and it certainly does not take off vertically. So it operated from a small runway, which was fine. When it got to the Isles of Scilly, it landed again at an airport on St Mary's, and then they used a number of smaller drones to fly around the islands because there wasn't infrastructure there. So these drones had to be able to deliver what they were delivering and return to where they were operating from without being able to be charged in between. So again, a different set of use cases, but really a reminder that actually in some parts of the UK and indeed the world, infrastructure is not necessarily going to be available, and the ability to charge is not going to be available. So some vehicles will have to operate with enough range to be able to take off and land and return to their base without being recharged. And there will have to be considerations about what they are actually landing on. We all have visions of these things landing in our garden to deliver parcels. Actually, that's probably, in my view, not going to happen, because the drone itself would need to know with a good degree of confidence of what's landing on a hedge in a swimming pool or anything, or what's actually below it. So I think there are limits to how flexible drones can be in terms of being able to deliver things and land in all sorts of different places. The final bit I was just going to highlight, there are other wider government programs. So the Connected Places Catapult on behalf of the Department for Transport have been doing a lot of work on zero emission flight infrastructure. And there are some examples there of some of the topics they are looking at, and it really just serves to highlight the increasing interest across government departments on looking at the challenge of infrastructure for aviation, and really looking at some of what the requirements are going to be. And as well as what you can see on the screen, there are also some activities going on at Teesside Airport, where they've installed a hydrogen refueling station at the airport, currently only for ground vehicles. But actually, that's a great first step, and they're looking to actually have some of the tugs and other sort of vehicles that service aircraft be running on hydrogen very soon, and that's going to be sort of part of the Tees Humber hydrogen transport hub. So again, a great progress and real indication that the government is taking this seriously in terms of what's required for these new forms of aviation. So yeah, that I think is my final slide. So thank you very much, and I will hand back to Emma.
Great, thank you so much, Simon. And I think that's really exciting. I think with that, it really kind of changes the way of kind of how we suppose we move people, but also products and goods as well in the future. And it's a really exciting challenge that's really kind of driving innovation in an area that's kind of, really much needed at the moment. And I'd like to just thank all of our speakers that we've had so far this morning. I think those have all been really excellent presentations that have set the scene and help us explore kind of what's going on now at the minute, what the direction of travel is, and kind of what's needed to make that happen, and some of the innovation that's kind of being developed at the moment. We do have a couple of questions in the box, so I'm going to bring a few of those to the floor now, if that's okay. And then from that we can have a bit of a discussion. Now we've got an interesting one here from one of the attendees, which is really looking at kind of in the future, do you think there's a way for electric cars to charge whilst driving along the roads? I'm going to come to you, Sam, for that one, if that's okay. Oh, you're just on mute, Sam, sorry.
Thank you for prompting me on that. I think for cars that's unlikely. I think
Yeah.
the opportunities that present themselves in the life of a car to be charged for the user to be ready to drive it are too great for the need of on travel charging. There's more of a debate for vehicles that have a higher percentage of their time in transit. There are discussions about heavy goods vehicles taking charge whilst in transit because of the different challenges that they present. I think the infrastructure challenges should not be underestimated of doing that. So the jury is very much out on whether that's a deliverable prospect. But for cars, I don't think so.
Great, thank you. Now, Sam, you mentioned HGVs, and we do have another question in the chat here about that, which really kind of looks at kind of the weight of batteries as being currently an issue, not just for aircraft, but for buses and HGVs, where perhaps the understrength of bridges may be challenged. Do we see step changes happen in battery technology coming where electric vehicles will in time weigh less than the current fossil fuel vehicles? And Tim, I'm going to come to you for that one, if that's okay.
So just unmute. Yeah, all I know is some of my colleagues are getting very excited about electric trucks, and I do think that is going to come. Probably it'll come quite quickly. It's obviously just not something that we're really focused on, aware of at the moment. There's some activity going on in the bus side, looking at different charging. Obviously electrification of buses is definitely a very live issue, but I think HGVs will come. It's a good point about infrastructure, strengths, bridges, and that sort of thing. I'm assuming we will get to a point where yes, we can achieve this with something that's quite feasible in terms of weight impact. But I don't know if any of I'm not an expert in this area. I don't know if any of my the other speakers have a view on that.
Sam, you've just raised your hand there. Did you?
Yeah. So in discussions with the vehicle manufacturers, they tend to engineer their vehicles within the limits of the regulations as they are at the moment. So there's a balance between the battery weight and the payload weight, and they'll maximize their payload weight within the regulations. So I'm not expecting to see any change in the gross vehicle limits of vehicles on the road. The possible qualification to that is that you can imagine seeing lighter empty running occurring, but back to my first slide, we should be avoiding empty running at all costs. So whether we see a benefit from that empty running, the empty vehicle could well be lighter, but in its duty cycle, it's going to be to the regulations that we have at the moment. Yeah. A further clarification that's just come into my mind, the balance between the axles might be subtly different in that in a bus, certainly all of the weight sits on the back axle at the moment, because that's where the engine is, that's where the mass of the vehicle is when it's empty running. And you could see a balance towards a more even distribution between the axles, and that might have a less of an impact on infrastructure. But I think it's marginal. I don't think there are any significant gains to be had in terms of lightening the loads on the roads.
Great, thank you, Sam, for that, and thanks for coming on that. I think that's a really interesting perspective and brings a few ranges of views in there. You've mentioned about, I suppose, regulations and regulatory kind of, I suppose, aspects of this, and I think that's kind of a question I maybe want to open to all of you. What are kind of some of the kind of key regulatory challenges or policy challenges that do exist at the moment that do need to be overcome or perhaps kind of reviewed and to enable us to kind of make this move and this transition to, a decarbonized energy system? Simon, if it's okay, I might come to you first for your thoughts on that.
I think in some ways regulation or the regulatory side of the power supply is actually one of our lesser worries. I think with the use of drones and unpiloted vehicles. The actual concerns from the regulator are more around the autonomy side and how you can safely fly lots of drones in a safe way without crashing into each other or buildings and things. I think the power side is actually fairly well understood, and battery powered drones are pretty well accepted. So there aren't as many concerns about that. The larger passenger aircraft side, I think what we're seeing at the moment, let's say, are hybrid aircraft or ones where, one engine is running on a traditional fossil fuel burning engine, the other one is running on a battery. So they've sort of taken this incremental step to help the regulators, and these are being done on existing aircraft that are already certified as safe for flight. So you're making a change to an existing aircraft, which obviously reduces the regulatory burden. I think in the future, when people want to design all new aircraft, that's when the challenges will become much greater. And obviously, the use of hydrogen aircraft is still fairly new. So I think it's a step-by-step process, but everything with aviation seems to take a bit longer than our friends in the land vehicle side. So I think we're being kind of cautious about some of the projections as to when these sort of aircraft will actually be carrying passengers in sort of normal service.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I suppose maybe from kind of the land surface or land transport aspect of it, was there anything else additional perhaps maybe you might wanted to add, Tim, to that?
Well, I mean, we face some quite interesting regulatory challenges in the project that we're building now around the transport side, but a lot of that was actually, from this point of view, was coming from the fact that we're connected to the transmission network, and that's pretty unusual for something as small as an EV, charging hub, where most people who are connecting to the transmission network are sort of large scale plants, processing plants and steel plants and that sort of thing. But we had some real challenges, and I think this is a general point is how regulation progresses and moves in sort of in line with innovation. I think there's a tension there, and certainly what we found was that in this case Ofgem's desire to keep things simple for National Grid and for the cost for consumers didn't necessarily support what we were trying to do in the innovation side. So that's a sort of general point. I mean, I think that there will be lots of issues on that front, on the distribution network side of things as well. But this certainly caused us a bit of a hiatus, and we needed to ensure that we had a sort of viable cost structure in order to connect to the network we're working on. I think that's a general point that will need to be dealt with in the distribution network too.
Great, thank you, Tim. Now we've got a couple of questions that have come in here from the audience, and really kind of, I suppose, wanting us to kind of explore a little bit more around hydrogen. I suppose kind of we've talked about the need to decarbonize and the need kind of for the power network to be able to provide a decarbonized energy system, which the transport system sits on top of. And there's been a lot of talk around batteries, but I suppose we haven't really kind of delved in too much into hydrogen refueling infrastructure in detail. And so I suppose there's kind of just a general kind of interest from the audience around how do we maybe envision that hydrogen backbone of transport is expected to run? Is it still too far down the line at the minute to be relevant? And perhaps how could we maybe even look at it in the realms of kind of the railway point of view? Sam, is it okay if I come to you to?
Yeah, no, I took my mic off mute because I felt I had something to add here. So couple of things, dimensions to that question. Timing. I would fully expect to see hydrogen vehicles running on the road and needing fueling infrastructure really quite quickly. So the first reasonable volume hydrogen demand in goods transport I see coming along next year. 2024, I think there'll be many more operators that are looking to start to trial those vehicles, and there will be fueling infrastructure that will be required. Now that early fueling infrastructure is probably not going to be, it's going to be very much at a pilot level, and not considered to be a network. Hydrogen fueling is going to be very different from electric vehicle fueling. It's going to be largely done in quite regulated environments, so suited to fleets, but not public access areas. The bus operators that are operating hydrogen vehicles at the moment are are fueling them behind the fence in a depot rather than anywhere near the public highway. And the regulation associated with fueling on the public highway, I think, is going to be a constraint to seeing an awful lot of that being developed. But we will see fleets, heavy fleets, fueling with hydrogen from 2024, 25 onwards, and networks starting to, well, the start of a network appearing at that time, and the kind of planning that enables fleets to transition is going to be coming forward. The timescale for buying the vehicles is probably less than timescale for investing in the infrastructure that will do the fueling. So there's a tension there between the fleet needing to know that the infrastructure is going to be there in order to make the investment decision, but the infrastructure to fuel is going to take longer than buying the vehicle. So there's a key to be unlocked. There's a lot to be you know what I'm saying. There's a conundrum. There's a conundrum to be unpicked there, and there are people thinking about how to unpick that at the moment. So we've a number of programs that should help to enable potential hydrogen users to see where that fueling can take place, and to enable the fueling providers to plan for that infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on a really, really important point there around kind of this tension around, they're, an interest from the market, and they kind of, perhaps maybe want to move in that way because there's commitment from businesses, organizations, industries to become net zero, and they want to, kind of make that transition and to start to adopt those technologies and solutions that are required to allow that transition to happen, but the infrastructure not being 100% there yet. So that uncertainty to kind of know what horse they need to be back in. And so kind of bringing those two elements together. And I think that connection and convening piece to understand kind of the demand and the supply is very, very important for sure.
I think it's more complex. It's more complex still than that, in that fleet owners have never bought anything other than an internal combustion engine, and have never fueled anything other than an internal combustion engine, and therefore their operational procedures are made for that. And they don't buy vehicles for the pleasure of owning a vehicle. They buy a vehicle to do a job, and that's their job. So, and there isn't in the market a group of people whose job it is to train or to do that behavioral change. So we've never done it before. And all of the internal combustion engine vehicle fleets out there at the moment, whether it's Kuhn and Nagel moving all the drinks around the country, or our local plumber with his fleet of 10 vehicles, have all got to go through that transition. They're all going to do it at a different pace. They're going to need different levels of support, and the answer is going to be different for all of them. And for me, that is the biggest challenge, is the questions that have not been asked, having answers ready and ways in which are answering those ready. And there's no natural population of people to engage with to help answer those questions. And that for me is something that needs to change in the next 3 years to support that transition that's going to happen in the decade after that.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly that kind of, I think we're all kind of moving at different paces, and there is not no one solution fits all for sure. Thank you so much for that. Tim, I'm going to come to you now. We've got a question in the Q&A box, which you said you're going to answer live, which is really around what is the sort of short-term vision for flats and terrace housing when it comes to at-home charging. Are you able to respond to that and kind of provide some?
Sorry, just to come off mute. I mean, I don't think there's a very easy answer for this. I don't think there's a very easy answer for this. And it's interesting, as the council we're working with, Oxford, are sort of putting their EV strategy together, and it's not there yet, but some of the initial pointers in that are looking to things that would sort of I suppose, work against providing a solution directly for flats and terrace houses. I mean, certainly for them, providing sort of pavement-based solutions. There are some very innovative things going on in Oxford. A guy who's kind of developed his own sort of sub pavement level charging conduit type solution. All these sort of things that we're looking at, but they're really difficult to do and not preferred. And I think on top of that, you've got the challenge of a lot of new development going up, and the council in this case, and I'm sure it's the same elsewhere, really thinking, well, how do we encourage people into public transport? You know, they really want to reduce the amount of private, journeys by, in this case, sort of 25% over the next decade. So encouraging street charging is maybe not aligned with that. That's not going to be very something that a lot of people want to hear. It also creates quite a lot of conflict, and we've seen this in some areas around parking. Certainly people who are used to parking on their streets, and then sort of people who are bringing their fleet car home, etc., and parking outside, causing sort of challenges. So all sorts of things. I think what it's driving towards is that, again, this kind of split, people who are in that situation may need to find hubs. Now, that might not be a large, speed hub. It might be a council car park. There's lots of that sort of stuff going on around Oxfordshire as well, but there'll be other sort of charging solutions for them. There are sort of street-based post chargers, being implemented where I live in Kingston and Oxford, etc. But I think there'll be a range of things, but I don't think there's a simple solution for everybody who's going to be living in a terraced house or a flat.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Tim. And I think that's something that's coming across. This is a very complex problem and a very complex challenge, and it requires, a range of different solutions across a range of different, modes of transport and types of infrastructure that's required to meet, the demands of society and of our economy as well. We've only just got a couple of minutes left before we do finish, and so I just kind of wanted to come around to each of you for, I suppose, one kind of final point or thought that you have, and maybe particularly from each of you to really kind of maybe reflect on, I suppose, in your experience to kind of to date in the projects that you've been in delivering, what has been kind of your biggest learning, and what's kind of been your biggest takeaway that you might want to share with the audience today as we kind of move towards this net zero transport system. Simon, if it's okay, I'm going to come to you first, then Sam, and then I'll come back to you, Tim, if that's okay.
I think the biggest learning has been the challenge, but also the value in us. So stepping outside of our usual comfort zone and actually working with energy companies, whether they are the likes of E.ON, who are a partner in some of our projects, who are looking very carefully at how they could supply energies to an airport, all the way through to some of the organisations producing green hydrogen in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, who are also in their own way very keen to understand how they can get hydrogen that they're producing in vast quantities to airports. So actually, it's been a real eye-opener, and we don't necessarily yet speak the same technical language, but it's been really worthwhile to actually engage with these organizations and really understand the part that they will have to play. Otherwise, I'm going to have a bunch of shiny aircraft sat on the ground, not able to go anywhere because we haven't worked out how to refuel them or recharge them. So yeah, I think engaging the energy companies has been a real eye-opener for us, and the interest they have in supporting this has been really positive.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. I think that kind of engaging beyond the industry in which you're operating in is so important and so key. Sam, if you're okay to share.
I'm going to reference the point I made previously, and that for me was the light bulb moment in realizing the challenge that we have to move from serving the first adopters. Those people are going to go and find a new technology, and they're going to adapt their lives to that new technology, to serving those that aren't interested in that process. They need to be walked through the process. They need to be helped to understand how as a fleet owner, it's going to change the way we do things, but actually there are significant benefits to be yielded from that transition. And talking them through that process, and for the private car user, that it isn't as scary as it should be, and that the infrastructure is actually coming along. Those are the things that for me are the biggest learning, is moving from our group of impassioned people who've been working in this area for a long time and take things for granted to addressing those concerns of people who don't take it for granted, but have got to come along the journey as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the thing. I think it's just thinking about everyone that this needs to serve and on how we can support and engage with them. Absolutely. And Tim, just one final point from you, if that's okay.
Yeah, just quickly for me, I think the key thing is this relationship with the local authority. I mean, they are so central in so many areas of this, you know, coordinating activities with the network operators to understand where we need power, working with the fleets to know what sort of use cases are appropriate here and there. But in our case, the contracting methods to install something that looks fairly straightforward, like a sort of Superhub, when you're using working with three different charge point operators, the contractual arrangements, when you're talking about a tender, you know, a local authority tendering process, are pretty complicated. Number of people involved, very, very complicated. So we need a lot of streamlining in understanding how to do that, and making it easy for other local authorities. I think we really want to learn from this project to be able to pass those learnings on to others.
Great, brilliant. Thanks, Tim. I suppose at this point it would be silly of me not to mention our Net Zero Places Innovation Network, which is all around supporting and working with local authorities in that way to support that kind of the procurement and innovation, but also that knowledge sharing, which is so, so important. I think, you know, there's a lot of exciting projects that are happening across the country, but how do we facilitate that kind of those learnings and those insights across those projects, so we can really kind of advance it and move much more quickly. I think just to kind of summarize the session today is really, you know, the transport system of the future will need to be more efficient, it needs to be cleaner, it needs to be smarter, and it's going to need to utilize various different enhanced technologies, digital communication, and autonomous as well. And this is going to, you know, to just echo a lot of the points that have come across here from our speakers this morning, it really will require collaboration, not just within the transport sector itself, but across other industries, other sectors, other types of stakeholders, whether that's kind of the energy sector, you know, local government, central government, and also the, you know, finance as well, green finance being really important to this. And this kind of is going to require just, you know, a move whilst we're kind of trying to decarbonize transport and provide something that's fit for purpose for the future. There's also the need to decarbonize the energy system alongside that, and also create a circular economy with low carbon supply chains. So there's a lot of different kind of elements to this, and it's quite complex, but I think it's really great to be able to see some of the real life innovation and projects that are happening on the ground right now across the UK. And I think that kind of builds in a little bit of hope that we are moving in the right direction. And I think it's really important that, you know, when we think about this, it's really important that we need to create those diverse connections to create that and drive that positive change. And I suppose I just like to give a shout out to KPN again, that, you know, if you are interested in learning more about our exciting portfolio of innovation transport projects, then do visit our website and do reach out. I want to just kind of say thank you all so much for attending this morning and for your engagement and your really insightful questions you've been able to pose here for the panel, and also to thank each of our panelists, Sam and Tim, for your, you know, really interesting and incredible insights into kind of where you see some of the challenges buyers are at now for the transport system. And begin, and, you know, what needs to be prioritized and how could problems really to drive innovation and to help us kind of build that transport system that's going to serve the needs of the economy and society as it evolves in the future. So it's just really for me to say that this webinar has been part of Green Infrastructure Week. And at 12 o'clock today, the Association for Consultancy and Engineering will be discussing carbon-free roads and whether our ambitions for net zero transport can be achieved. So if you are interested in kind of, you know, being more involved in more transport conversations today, do register for that, and feel free to look at other events. I know that shared some utility finance event that's also ATN tomorrow, and you can see all the details of that on the greeninfrastructureweek.com Wednesday. Take care.